Hi, Dr. Fabrizio here again with the second video in this little series where first we were talking about some of the principles of learning, some of at least my principles of learning. Remember, there are lots of things out there. And now we want to talk a little bit about concepts. So now we want to actually take some things that are useful techniques, useful strategies for you to think about concepts of how we should be studying and how we should be learning. And I'm going to tell you that each of these concepts, so each concept will be considered at a later date in separate videos. But let's begin with at least getting an introduction, right? Something that you can start to think about. So the first concept is what's called spaced practice or spaced studying. So in spaced practice or spaced studying, the thought here is that learning requires reflection. And I will go over each one of these separately with some examples, but essentially in spaced practice, the thought is, and the evidence actually is very clear, that having time in between practice or study sessions is more beneficial than trying to do massed practice or mass studying. So you will often hear this word massed practice or massed studying. This is not beneficial. And spaced practice or space studying is what you want to do. So for example, in anatomy class, let's say we go over some topics in anatomy and you decide to study and you use the retrieval studying that we'll talk about here in a second on your first day, and then the next day you don't do any studying for anatomy. Maybe you read about it, maybe you just look over your notes, but you're not actually actively studying, or maybe you're studying another course. Then 2 days later you come back to anatomy and you study anatomy again. Much more beneficial than trying to mass study in one small time frame. This is analogous to cramming. Cramming is considered mass studying in a very short time frame right before an exam. And this spaced practice or spaced studying is much more beneficial than that because you're spacing your study times out over the term or over some period of time, which gives you a much better chance of trying to recall that information and trying to actually create a memory of that information in your long-term memory. Okay, so spaced practice, excellent technique. I'm going to jump down to retrieval. Retrieval is, I think, the king of study techniques. And spaced practice and retrieval practice combined, the king and queen. These are the concepts that will really help you develop mastery in the material. Retrieval studying involves really testing yourself. So think of this as self-testing. And I'll often tell my students, this is, if you have a page of notes, can you recreate that page of notes? So maybe you read through your notes, you essentially study, but you're reading through your notes, and then you come back and you try to recreate on a blank piece of paper all of that important information. Then you look at the paper and you test. You see how much you got right and how much you missed. Then you look at the material again and you come back and do the retrieval method again. So this is, you're looking at your material, then you're trying to recall that material or test yourself. Okay, and then you are grading yourself. What did you miss? What do you need to work on? What do you need to go back and look at? This is often a technique that people use with study cards or index cards or flashcards, where you may go through a series of flashcards, and if you know something, you put that into a pile that maybe you'll look at 2 days later or 3 days later. And if you don't know something, you're wrong, you look at that card again the next day. right? And you're trying to develop mastery of that particular card. That's a perfect example of putting spaced and retrieval together. So you're using a flashcard. See if I can spell here, flashcard. And this actually is called the Leitner technique, where if you know the card, you look at it days later. If you don't know the card, you look at it the next day. Okay? So that's a way of testing yourself. Do I know the card? Do I not know the card? Did I just guess at it? And you've got to really be reflective about this. You've got to really try and answer the questions correctly. Do I really know it, or did I guess at it? Okay. Next, we have interleaving. So this is looking at multiple things at once. And for a lot of people, it may seem that this will take longer, and it may take longer, but in the end, you're making more connections. You're creating more memory connections. Maybe even you're practicing skills. You're creating more motor programs. You're creating more neural connections by trying to interleave the material. And that means, let's say, for example, in anatomy, you're studying a region. Maybe you study the entire region. So you're studying multiple components at once. You're studying innervation, you're studying function, you're studying muscle, you're studying vessels, you're studying layers of the tissues. You're using multiple concepts. Okay? Or maybe you're looking at multiple courses. So for example, if I take anatomy and I'm looking at, in anatomy, I'm looking at the flexors of the arm or the forearm, and I combine that with studying manual muscle testing for those components, or maybe I combine that with goniometry for those components, or maybe I combine that with something from my orthopedic course. So I'm mixing my courses together to try and answer the so what question. Remember that from the very beginning. We want to answer the so what question. And that will make things stick. That's going to help you master the material. Okay? Another concept, something that you can work on, is varied practice. We are on number 4. So varied practice. So varied practice taps into different higher order centers of your brain, especially when it comes to motor skills, where if, for example, this is a great one for some of our motor skills in PT school, instead of just practicing a manual muscle test or just practicing goniometry, I'm putting those together into an exam. So I'm practicing the components, but I'm putting the components into an exam. And maybe in my exam I have a patient problem that's varied. Maybe I have a patient problem that's got a contusion. So maybe there's a contusion, maybe there's a muscle strain, maybe there's a traumatic injury. Right? I'm constantly varying the way I practice or the way I handle that patient. I'm constantly varying the way I look at the information, the way I'm studying the information, and the way that I'm applying the information. Number 5, discrimination. I'm going to rewrite that for you. Discrimination. This is really an expansion of so what. I'm trying to understand relationships. I'm trying to understand how one topic affects another. Okay? So discrimination. So again, in anatomy, we talk about, let's say, for example, all the structures that attach to the coracoid process of the scapula. And you have multiple structures there. You have ligaments, you have several muscles, and you must be able to discriminate. You must be able to be precise about those attachments in order to understand function and in order to understand the consequence of injury. And then the last concept that we really add here is reflection. It is not a bad idea for you to just write a little journal that reflects on what you learned. What did you learn today? What did you have trouble with? What was difficult? What kind of great gains did you make? Right? Really, did my study technique work? I studied for this material and I went to class, and in the class I felt comfortable with the way the information was laid out because I understood it, because I studied. Or I didn't feel comfortable, so I may need to change the way I study. I may need to do something differently. These techniques, again, each one will be a separate video with some more examples and a little more concrete evidence to support it, a little bit more application. We'll come up with some examples, but I think this is a good start for you to at least come up with some examples and to think about how you study and then what you need to do to change that. Remember, the techniques are varied and they're changeable, and you can adapt them to whatever you need, and you can change them if you need to. You should be able to bounce back and forth between different techniques because different courses may be more amenable to other techniques. Okay, hope that helps. Talk to you soon. Thank you.